It was 1991 when, as a pastor, I went on my very first work and witness trip. From that day until this one, God has been reshaping my heart and my mind. He's been making himself clear and known to me in many, many parts of the world. And I just want to publicly say thank you to you, Pastor Ed, and to Shirley and the mission team for the invitation today to come and talk about Africa. I love your theme, Into Africa. And what a great time we did have last night. Thank you to those who prepared the meal. It was outstanding African food, and we had a great time together. So thank you for the privilege today to talk about something that goes deep into my heart. Across the years, I've had a encounter that I often call a Jacob moment. Jacob is a man who had some tough times in his growing up years. His name means grabber, and if you read his story, which starts in about the 23rd chapter of Genesis, you find that he's always grabbing for things. In the 28th chapter, we have a story tucked away that introduces us to a sleeping Jacob. We are told that he has one more time stolen his blessing from his brother, and his brother's not happy, and now he's on the run. And Jacob, in exhaustion, comes to the end of the day, and he finds a rock. Are you hearing me okay? I feel like my mic's falling away. You all right? Then I'll relax and just talk. He's exhausted. He finds a rock. He makes it a pillow, and he lays his head upon it. And the Word tells us that a ladder drops from heaven, or as some translations have it, it's a staircase. Up and down the ladder, the angels ascend and descend, and at the top, God stands. And in the morning when Jacob awakens, he declares aloud in verse 16, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He calls the place Bethel. It's a house of God. This is a God place. And so when I say to you this morning that I have had Jacob moments in my work in world missions around the world, first as a pastor, and I've had several opportunities as a superintendent to make journeys to different parts of the world to train pastors and to work on projects. Again and again, I've come to these stopping points to say God is in this place. And if God is in this place, He's inviting us to respond. It was a Saturday. The Washington Pacific District was gathering for a mission rally. I had taken my people from Kirkland, the place that I was pastoring, to hear Hugh Freeberg, a veteran missionary who had been to Africa, and to come and share with us the work that was going on there. We took a break on that Saturday afternoon, and I went up to Hugh and I said, "Hugh, I have always wanted to go to Africa. Since I was a little boy, the pictures of the animals, the stories of missionaries like Schmelzenbaugh. Every time a missionary from Africa would come, I'd be front and center. I wanted to hear the stories about Africa. And now I thought my church was ready to take a trip to Africa, and I said, Hugh, where should we go?" And without hesitation, he said, "Mozambique." I was interested in his response because I knew that a number of years before, Hugh Freeberg, as a missionary in Mozambique, had been put into prison. I was one of tens of thousands of Nazarenes around the world that was praying for the release of missionary Dahl and missionary Freeberg. We didn't know what was going on in that prison, and it was a frightening time because war was ravaging that nation. I did my homework. I learned that Mozambique had had 26 years of uninterrupted war, 13 years of independence from Portugal, and 13 years as the Marxists had come in and tried to disrupt and take over this nation. 1 million died of disease. 1 million died from war. 1 million were displaced. This was a country that was devastated. And in my research, I discovered that nobody wanted to go to Mozambique. The devastation was so great on my first visit there, the roads were literally lined with cars that had been stopped, the occupants murdered, and the cars torched because they didn't want people trying to escape from the country. Everywhere in those early days, the evidence of the war and the devastation were great. I learned in my research that there are more unexploded landmines in Mozambique than any country in the world. I literally had people in my church begging me not to go, and I simply promised them, I'll stay 25 steps behind the missionary, and you don't have to worry about me. But go we did. What we discovered in being in the country of Mozambique and hearing more about the story is that they were a church that was a lot like the Acts 1 church. You know, Jesus told us all in Acts chapter 1 to go and to keep going. You start in Jerusalem and you go to Judea and you go to Samaria and you go to the ends of the earth. But if you read Acts carefully, the church never went out until persecution came in. Persecution in church history has always made the church stronger. And I've described for you what happened in 26 years of war, and you wonder what happened to the Christians that were there, what happened to the Church of the Nazarene. It's a place where we had been since 1922, and we had this little mission station in a place called Tavani, and we had a small work. It was effective, but it was small in a country that's 1,100 miles long. And when the war ended, we found out that the gospel of Jesus Christ was everywhere. Because as the Christians fled their homes, they started churches and told people about the hope that the Lord Jesus Christ could bring. But those two missionaries that had been imprisoned, one of them on this Saturday afternoon was standing in front of me and telling me that I should go to Mozambique. It was a flashback for Robbie and I. There had been a time earlier in our lives when there had been an intersection with the story of Mozambique. I was a student at our seminary in Kansas City, and Robbie had a job down the hill in our Global Ministry Center. She worked in World Missions, and her boss was Helen Temple. You longtime Nazarenes will know the name Helen Temple, prolific book writer, editor of The Other Sheep. It was an exciting place for her to work, and it was exciting for me to come home at night and hear the stories of what was going on in the world, because Robbie was on the front seat watching it all happen through the office. She came home to me one day and said, wow, something really unusual happened today. And I said, tell me about it. And she said, we received in the mail a package of notes that have come from Mozambique. And I said, tell me more. Because what we knew is we had two missionaries in prison, and there was no way for the outside world to get in because everybody else had fled, and they had shut down communication carefully. But here's what was going on. The prisons in Mozambique don't feed the prisoners. And the only way a prisoner could get a meal is if family would bring in food. And so the Nazarenes that were there around the prison would cook meals, and every day they would take in food to the missionaries. And in time they figured something out. We can take a little piece of paper and put it on the inside of a cake and take it through the guards and give it to the missionaries, and as they eat they will find the paper and they can write notes on the paper. And they come back days later to give them some more food. And they bring with them, get this, in their pocket, a tube of toothpaste. The missionary would hand them the note. They roll it up tight, stick it into the toothpaste in case they're searched as they leave. Who's going to look inside the tube of toothpaste? And on the outside, the people began to gather these notes, and somehow they got them out of the country, and somehow they got them to Kansas City, to our general leaders. And on this particular day, Robbie was given the task of typing the notes that the missionaries had written to their wives and to their children and to the church. And you may have seen it. It's been a lot of years now, but there was a missionary book called The Toothpaste Express. The story of what it was like to be a prisoner in Mozambique in the 70s in a horrific time when the future of these missionaries and the future of the Nazarene leaders from Mozambique that were also in prison with them was in danger. But here we were now, beyond all of that, and ready to go back in. When the peace accord was finally signed, we made the grand discovery that the church had exploded, but what we discovered is that Tavani, that mission compound, where the missionaries had lived and worked, the place where they had trained pastors to go lead churches, a place where they had raised up teachers to fill schoolrooms, a place where they had ministered to physical bodies but also trained nurses, so that there could be the gospel with hands that were ministering to the needs of the people. This place was devastated. Early on, Robbie and I had the privilege of going to Tavani, rich with history. But even these many years later, as we looked around at the buildings that were full of bullet holes, we heard the story from the Nazarenes of the time when the rebel soldiers came to the campus, went into their sanctuary, took out all of the Bibles, took out all of the hymnals, went to the library and took out off the shelves all the books for pastoral training and for nurse training and teacher training, and they made a big pile out in front of the church. They filled it with gasoline and torched it and danced around as all of the books and Bibles and hymnals were destroyed. And still, with tears running down their faces, they talk about that night when the Nazarenes hid in the shadows, their hearts torn out, their missionaries gone, their leaders in prison, their books destroyed, their buildings shot up, people now fleeing for their lives. It was a devastating time. What would we do next in the story of Mozambique? Well, there was a discovery made that during the war, there were those who were very, very faithful to try to keep the pastoral training alive. Some of the leaders that had not been in prison went down to Maputo, and there they started a little school in a church. Times were so hard. There were no pencils for students. There was no chalk to write on the board. In fact, they told us that they took their tests by getting concrete, and I can remember as a child getting a stick, and out in the driveway you could use your stick and write things. And that's literally how they took their tests. The poverty, the lack was so great. But with the war over, as the government wanted to try to put things back together, they looked to the Church of the Nazarene and said, "You people have been generous with us in compassionate expression, and we want to do something for you." And at the outskirts of the capital city, they gave us 2 city blocks to build our schools and to find again a place to do the training that had been happening in the isolated part of Tavani. This 2 city block was not being developed. Squatters were moving in. And when squatters move in, it's hard to get squatters back out. And so the future was not certain, because what had happened in the meantime, once the property had been given, is that there had been a plan put together of buildings and gardens and housing. And these 2 city blocks were going to be a hive for the church. But all it was now was a place for the squatters to come and to take over. But after 3 years, finally, a team from Colorado First Church of the Nazarenes came to start a building. And then my church came in as a second team to finish it. I would say to you today that while in Africa, I had a Jacob moment. I could see clearly the imprints of the ladder. God was there. God was doing marvelous things in Mozambique. A new church was being planted every 4 days. And it seemed so very obvious that as the church was exploding, pastors had to be trained. The Bible college had to be built. God, you're up to something here. God, what are you going to do about it? It was exciting to see. But I thought my time in Africa, that one visit had been fulfilled and it would probably be the end of it. But God had some other things in mind. We moved into what was a whirlwind week in our lives. It was Monday and we were getting ready to come home. We just finished a day at Kruger Park and seen the Big Five and had a marvelous time in God's creative nature. Just before we were ready to head to the airport, we got word that Robbie's dad had died. And so we were going to be coming home to do his funeral. We arrived back in Seattle on Wednesday, headed to Nampa on Good Friday. I preached the sermon and buried a good man on that Good Friday. On Saturday, we hastened home into Seattle. Sunday, we had a joyous day of celebration with our church. In the midst of death and chaos, what better thing to do than to gather with God's people and celebrate the living Christ? And then on Monday, it was time for our district missionary convention to begin. I was the district work and witness coordinator. Before I'd gone to Africa, I'd said to the council, you want me to find a place for us to go, and I'm headed to Africa. What if I bring home the idea and we could go to Africa? And they said, no way. We've been to Africa. We're not going to Africa again. We want a project in Asia. I'd gone to Africa and sent emails and hoped when I got home I'd have a project to present on that Monday night. But God had made it pretty clear to me that before Monday night I needed to come to the council and say, council, I got to beg of you. God's up to something in Mozambique. We've got to go. And I'm just wondering, council, if it'd be okay if tonight I just stood up in front of the gathered people and just told them a little bit about Mozambique and see if we could recruit some people and go back and help get that Bible college built, because we've got to train pastors for the explosion of the church. And I got to tell you, it was a great joy when they affirmed that proposal. But I was overwhelmed that night as I stood and had about 7 minutes to talk. Set up a little display in the foyer. Robbie and my daughter Olivia had put together a few pictures, and we had a sign-up sheet. And 78 people that night signed up to go to Mozambique with us. We said, okay, we're going to send 3 teams. We're going to go in and build that second building. And I was the one who went in with a third team. I was there to kind of wrap up that project, thinking, okay, I get a second trip to Mozambique. This will probably be it. But it was our final night on that second trip, the completion of the 3 teams and the completion of the dorm. The Mozambique people, with their marvelous hospitality, had prepared a dinner for the team, and everybody had left the work site and gone to shower and began to pack and get ready for this meal. And I found myself alone on the roof. I was tightening some fasteners on the metal roof that we had installed. Our task was done. I sat on that roof that day. The sun was setting. As Robbie shared last night, when the sun goes down at 6, and it goes down at 6 every day of the year around the calendar, it gets dark quick. I was experiencing a setting sun. We probably had another 30 minutes of daylight, and I watched 2 students come out and put their sticks in the ground and begin to kick a soccer ball. And I just looked at those students and thought, those are the future leaders. Those are the ones who are going to make a difference in this country. These are pastors for the future. But, oh God, there's got to be more. I've made it a practice across the years when I take a work and witness trip to find a missionary book about the country I'm going to and read it while I'm there. It's fun to be in a country and read about the country. And I found this little book that was called The Mozambique Story, and I would read a chapter each night, and it would talk about people, and I think I met that person today. It'd talk about students, and I could hear them outside the window after their day of study singing, because music is such a big part of the culture of Mozambique. I got down near the end, and I read the final chapter, and I'm going to tell you, it really grabbed my heart. The book had been written by a missionary by the name of Frank Howey. Not only was he a missionary, he was a dreamer. He's the one who had drawn up the plans for that 2-block place there to make it a thriving center for the work of the Church of the Nazarene in Africa. But I learned while we were there that a couple months prior to our coming, he was swimming one day in the Indian Ocean and died of a heart attack. That last chapter was simply entitled, "The College, the Key." If Mozambique is going to reach this country, it's got to have trained pastors. And Frank Howey said the college will be the key to the future work of this country. And I said, God, Howey is dead. Who's going to do it? And the ladder came down. And the God who stood at the top said, you're going to do it. And I'll confess to you, I had a very sleepless night that last night in Africa. I said, God, what do you mean I'm going to do it? What is it you think that ought to happen here? And as I tossed and turned in my bed, I began to envision a 6-fold plan that we can do that might help this country. Because God's at work here. This is a Jacob moment. He has shown up, and we've got to join what God is doing. And so, in that night, I decided I would try to recruit 21 teams to go build. If you're going to have a campus and train pastors, you got to have people called. What better way to do it than to have youth camps? We could maybe, God, get 1,000 kids together. And what if you were to call 100 of them to be pastors? It could strengthen the work here in Mozambique. We got to raise scholarship money because students can't afford to come. And if we're going to come, we got to do compassionate work. And I got to get some NMU students engaged. And hopefully that some of those would be called to missions. And yeah, God, we're going to try to raise $250,000 and build 3 buildings. The next night as we were headed to Kruger, we stopped in Swaziland to spend a night, and interestingly enough, I was sleeping in Hugh Freeburg's home. He was in the States on furlough, but he was a missionary in Swaziland. So this man who told me I ought to go to Mozambique, I'm now sleeping in his home, and I asked for an audience with our missionary and with our field coordinator, and my wife, who is the one who has the greater faith in our relationship, sat in the other room and for the first time overheard me saying to them, this is what I'd like to see if we could do. I didn't know if they'd like it or not. They agreed to it. And here's the fun thing. We named it that night. We're going to call this the Mozambique Miracle. Because you know what, folks? If you dream some big dreams for God, the only way they're going to happen is if God shows up to help you get there. And these were ideas that were off the charts, and I had no idea how we would go about doing them, but why not try? If God's there, why not get involved? The missionaries began to show up with pickups, and they'd say to the squatters, we're going to relocate you. We're not just going to tell you to get off. We're going to take your belongings and we're going to move you to a place. It's a little farther out of town and it's not as convenient for you, but it's land the government says you can live on. And they would pack up their things, and sometimes they'd have to wait while people would dig up the relatives that they had buried outside their homes right there in the property. But with generosity and mercy, they moved them all off, and we began to regain the property so that we could move in. And if I could this morning for just a few more moments, I'd like to tell you the story of what God did. Do you know what we need to do more of on our journey? We need to celebrate God. We need to get away from the dark news that captivates our hearts and puts fear within us and begin to see again that God is at work in our world. The God of miracles is still here. And he did in Ephesians 3 things for us, far more than you can ever expect or imagine. I told you I wanted 21 teams. I didn't have much trouble recruiting 20 teams. But there was a week in February in 2000 that I could get no one to go to Mozambique. I was frustrated. But God was at work. I don't know if you remember it, but maybe I can call it up in your memory bank. But in 2000, there were monsoon after monsoon after monsoon that came into southern Africa, and it rained so hard and so long that all of the dams in South Africa were about to break. And the South African government said, we've got to open the dams or we're going to lose them. But to open the dams means all that water is going to rush right through Mozambique. We were there for a youth camp, and the last day it began to rain. That was the first day of rain. It rained so hard that we had to leave camp early because it was a metal roof and we could not hear. Even with amplification, you couldn't hear a thing inside the building. And as we went home, we began to follow the news, and the floods were coming, and the people were warned, but the people couldn't believe that it would happen. But when those dams were opened, thousands of people drowned. Tens of thousands lost their homes. We got stories of people hanging on to trees for dear life, women giving birth in trees because they were there for days, snakes that were curled up with people in trees for survival, and we had a pastor who preached into the darkness, and hundreds around who could hear him were converted, and soon he had a new church when the waters finally receded. If I'd had a working witness team there that week, they'd have been staying at the place where we would set up camp. But for those 2 weeks that they would have been there, helicopters were coming and going. Aid was being brought in. Doctors were coming from Europe. God protected the land for the people who would do the compassionate work. God is at work. In times when you think what you plan and hope for is frustrated, you never know what God is up to. 1,000 for a youth camp. We went in 2000 and ran 2 of them. We had our 1,000. But they were so successful that we decided we had to come again the next year. And the next year we had 6 youth camps, and we scattered over the whole country of Mozambique. Our goal is 1,100 called. We had 3,000 teenagers show up for youth camp. And 350 of them gave testimony. God has called us this week to be pastors of the gospel in the Church of the Nazarene. This week I've been at general board meetings, and Phil Chambo, who is a general superintendent now and is from the country of Mozambique, said to me, Randy, I'm working on a centennial because the work will be 100 years old in 22. I'm working on a centennial book. And he said, I keep coming across emails and messages from people in Mozambique who said that the youth camps changed the trajectory of the church. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, after the war, the youth had left the church. The old guard was still there and still doing things, but the youth were going a different direction. But when the church sponsored youth camps, the teenagers said, the church cares about us. And the young people came back to the church. And he said, I think in our history we're going to have to say that God used the youth camps to strengthen and redirect the work of the church in Mozambique. Ademi, one of the 37 that was commissioned as a missionary last Monday night at that tremendous service. He was our guide this summer, and Robbie and I hadn't been to Mozambique for over 15 years. We went back to check on it, and he met us at the airport. I said, Demi, tell me your story. And he said, oh, Randy. He uses my name in about every sentence. It's an interesting way to communicate. But, oh, Randy. He said, oh, Randy, I remember you. And I said, tell me what? And he said, I was at the youth camp. And God called me. And now he's one of the strongest leaders in the country. God's up to something. God does the miraculous. We wanted to do compassionate ministry. I can't just go in and teach, and you can't just go in and build. You got to go in and meet needs. And I'm saying, God, I need a doctor and I need a dentist. We got to meet the real needs of these people. Our church was heavily involved in Venezuela, and even though now we are getting drawn into Mozambique, we made a trip to Venezuela, and it was a Sunday afternoon. And we were going to a service, and I was going to preach that night. There was a gal on our bus. Milena was her name. She was born in Venezuela. Her folks had divorced, and she moved to Argentina, and she'd always wanted to come back to her birth country, and she showed up while we were there, and she was in the bus. And I wanted to tell her about Mozambique, and I thought, that's stupid. She's a South American. Why would we want to talk about Mozambique? And one of my team members said, Randy, tell her about Mozambique, and I did. Tears running down her face. She said, I'm a doctor. I speak Portuguese, and one of my top 3 life goals is to make a trip to Mozambique. Could I go with you? I went to my dentist, and I said, you know what, you got to go to Mozambique with me. He said, okay. And then he opened my mouth, and I didn't get to say another word. Unfortunately, I had to go back in a couple of weeks, so I took pictures, and I walked in and they said, Dr. Welch, I want you to go to Mozambique with me. He said, I told you I would. I said, oh, you were serious? He said, I am. Our local Kiwanis raised over $10,000 to buy portable dental equipment. He got his partner and took him in with him, and we set up a dental clinic. Usually they just get their teeth pulled, but he wanted to do hygiene as much as he possibly could. And you can't believe the line of people to see the doctor and the line of people to see the dentist. And then a big black sedan pulled up. I was called over quickly because people weren't sure what was going on. This black car stops. This big African Mozambique man gets out, black suit, white shirt. It's pretty obvious this is a government official. I went up and said, sir, could I be of any help to you? And through a translator, he said, yes. I'm the head of dentistry in Mozambique, and you have not gotten permission to be in my country. I can't tell you how far my heart dropped. Had he come to shut us down? Do you see that long line of people that are waiting for some hope and some help? There was this pregnant moment of uncertainty. And then a big smile came to his face and said, I'm a fellow Nazarene. Welcome to my country, but don't you ever come again without telling me you're here. And I found out that day there were at that time 17 dentists in the whole country. But God, doing his miracle, was at work in that place. We got NMU students to go with us. They set up computer labs for us. We would ship in computers wrapped in wedding dresses. Because what the missionaries would say to us is the women here can't afford to get married and have to keep postponing it. Could you get us some wedding dresses? And we brought in wedding dresses so they could be rotated and used again and again and again in the country. There's so many little ways, if we have our eyes open, that we can help the people of the world. And I got someone to offer me $50,000 for scholarships, and if we'd get matching, and we found 50,000 more, and we raised 100,000 we'd hoped to raise for scholarships. And then I told you we wanted to raise $250,000 and build 3 buildings. We raised $750,000 and built 7 buildings. God shows up. When God gives you a dream as a church, when God gives you a dream as an individual, when God gives you a dream for your life, don't limit him. Don't be scared by the size of the dream. Because like Jacob, you may wake up and find yourself in a place to say, God is here. And I've got to respond to him. Well, I'm here this morning to tell you the work's not finished. Today there are over 2,000 churches in Mozambique, Nazarene churches. There are 359 ordained elders. There's a big gap there. There are hundreds of others that are in training. But the Bible College is in the south, and we need to build some centers in the north. And I heard last night a dream on the Mission Council that Moscow, Idaho could be involved in somewhere in Africa. And I'm just telling you, we have now launched Mozambique 2.0. It's time for another edition of the miracle. And I just have to wonder today, might God be stirring your heart? A Jacob moment. I think of the grand story of Scripture. The father started it. Son, will you go? And the son said yes. The son came and he taught and he showed us the way and he died and he's alive today, and now he asks, you my followers, will you go? And I remind you this morning, going comes in many packages. You can go and participate. The four circles of Acts 1:8 all have boundaries. We got to cross the boundary of a street to reach our neighbor. We got to cross the boundaries to get into Judea. We got to cross the boundaries to get into our Samarias and work with the people that are easily forgotten and marginalized, and they're all around us. God help us as a church not to think of ourselves as Noah's Ark, a place to come in here and be saved in this culture. We are a sent movement by God to move into this culture with the good news of Jesus Christ. And I got to believe that God's continually calling His people in all of our churches to be on the move across borders and boundaries that we have. Some we've set up locally, and some we set up around us, and some we set up nationally. God's calling us to be people who participate. You can go with your prayers. I had people who said, I can never go to Africa, Randy, but I promise I'll pray for you. Boy, that makes a difference. We've done work in China, and I don't know if you understand what's going on in China now, but they're cracking down. We're having to change the work there. And I think of the folks that we have living there. Oh, they need God's protection and help. Monday night when we commissioned 37 new Nazarene missionaries, the largest class in decades, 7 of them pictures were not taken and last names were not given because they're heading into creative access areas. They need the prayers of the church. You ought to wake up in the morning and say, oh God, protect the people who today are on the front lines. And so many times we just wake up and think of all the woes that we have and the stuff we're concerned about that's going on right around us. Don't forget the persecuted church. We have a creative access country where 90% of the Christians there are Nazarene. And 2 years ago, 50 pastors were put to death. That means 45 Nazarene pastors, if you do the math, were put to death. Church, would you pray? God is still moving, but God's people must be people of prayer. You can go by sending. I think of the children last night and today. Wouldn't it be great if I'm looking at the eyes of some kids who are going to hear a call from God to be missionaries? I was called to be a pastor when I was 8. I've heard of calls even younger. But parents, you've got to facilitate. You've got to create the idea that your kids can listen to and follow the call of God wherever He would take them. Christmas this year was a time when all of our kids came home. That's a special time. It only happens every 2 years. And we were so looking forward to it. And in November, my daughter said we'd have a chance to go to Indonesia over Christmas break and work with missionary children, and we're going. And instead of the 2 weeks we would have with them, we had 4 days with them. And as they left, we looked at one another and said, this doesn't seem right. We wanted time with our kids. And then my wife looked at me and she said, what else would we expect? we raise them. That if the kingdom of God gives you an opportunity to serve, you take it. And then we reached out hands of blessing that they would give their time to go work with missionary kids in transition who desperately needed some folks to come alongside and work with them. Parents, grandparents, tell your kids the story that God still calls, and don't put fear into their hearts of this world of ours. Put within them the love that God has for the broken and the lost and the marginalized all around the world. And yes, you can go with your giving. Moscow Church of the Nazarene has a rich history of supporting missions, and I say thank you. But we never stop and just look back and celebrate. We turn to the future and say, okay, God, what are you wanting to say to us now? I don't know if you'd raise up a team out of this church to go to central Mozambique and build a building or help complete a building. I don't know how he might use you, but I just do believe that a church that's missional, that has their eyes wide open, will always be a church that God will use to advance the kingdom. Yes, my friends, this could be a Jacob moment in somebody's life. God is here. God's been calling me, and I'm going to say yes today. God's challenging me, and I'm willing to go. God's put a burden on my heart, I'm going to pray. And yes, the mission enterprise of the Church of the Nazarene needs financial support. Maybe God is calling you today to give sacrificially in ways you never have before, so that the work of the kingdom can continue. Father, thanks for being with us today. Thanks for being the God of miracles. And sometimes we need to look at our own stories, and we need to look around and listen to stories of others to be reminded that you haven't forsaken us, and we're not alone in this world, and we don't have our hands tied behind our back. We have a God who is saying today what he said in Acts 1. If you will receive the Holy Spirit, if you will really open your hearts and lives to the empowering and impouring and the cleansing and purifying work of the Holy Spirit, you can go be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And oh Lord, today we say, Holy Spirit, fall afresh on us. Fall fresh on us. And give us eyes to see and a willingness to go in the way that you call us. May we see the ladder of heaven today. Hear the voice of God and say, surely God has been in this place. I don't know, Pastor Ed, maybe we just could even close with a prayer time. Why don't you stand with me? I don't know if today anything might just stir your heart and you'd like to come, because the altar is a place where we often settle the deep heart business with God. But I think an open altar could be a part of this closing prayer. Or maybe it's just for you to respond to God where you are right now. But I felt this is a God moment.